Welcome. We're so glad you can join us today. We're going to start off at the beginning here with ancient Egypt. Egypt is a unique culture in the ancient world because of its continuity. Indeed, if one were to use one word to describe Egypt, it would be continuity. Now, in this lecture, we are going to deal with the land of Egypt, the rulers of Egypt, the religion, the conquests, and the role or interaction it had with Israel. By organizing it in this way, we hope that we'll have a better understanding. Now, this will be different from a lot of other types of lectures or courses because in discussing things this way, our primary objective is to see Egypt in its full picture, but also to see it primarily why it's important for us as people who hold fast to the Bible to see Egypt in this way. So let's begin with the land. Now, the land of Egypt is absolutely important for us to begin to understand. The land influenced Egypt just as much as any other land in the ancient world, and even today influences us. Not just in architecture or art or priorities, but indeed in the very belief system. And at the center of Egypt is the Nile River. Now, there are several things that are important for the Nile River. First off, that we need to remember is that the regular flooding in the Nile River gave a sense of continuity and regularity. This is very different from other rivers which would flood or expand in ways that were quite irregular and indeed dangerous. This is definitely the case when we talk about Mesopotamia. And that's why the Mesopotamian areas like Babylon and Assyria and other kingdoms there had a notion that the gods were terrifying and that chaos was right around the corner. And while the whole themes of chaos and order are something that we see in all major belief systems, the way that chaos is chained is a lot more structured here in Egypt. This was not just a security, the Nile River, but it also provided for them. Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient world. Indeed, when the Romans would take over, Egypt began supplying most all of the grains that the Romans themselves needed. And the regular grain shipment from Egypt was a prime and lucrative position for any Roman bureaucrat to hold. So, this breadbasket, as it were, was incredibly important throughout the ancient world. And it led to the understanding of Egypt's worldview, of stability, continuity, and provision. The next thing is that the desert surrounds this thin strip of green area. And the desert provided a natural buffer as well as creating an insular culture. Now, let's imagine that you're an Egyptian. Let's imagine that you're living here by the banks of the Nile. You have this river that is providing everything you'll possibly need. It is coming and flooding in regular occurrences so that you can make plans and make sure that your house and your livelihood are not in the way of the floods when they come. That flooding will deposit this tremendously fertile silt across the landscape, allowing you to plant, again, with regularity and provide all that you need. Just beyond the Nile River and the banks and the areas that you've irrigated and the areas that are flooding regularly is a desert. A desert no one really wants to cross And if they do cross, they'll come in worn out and haggard. You can see what would happen here. If people have everything they need, they become both steady and happy in their area. They can also become decadent and complacent. Both things happen to Egypt, and its continuity being protected and being provided for in its unique landscape is what led to its very unique culture. Indeed, at the heart of Egypt is the Nile. And this allows them to focus inward in ways that other ancient empires couldn't or wouldn't. But exactly how did all of this come about? How did this play out in the ruling and in the governing of Egypt? Well, let's talk about the rulers. Egypt was known throughout the ancient world as being ancient, which is odd for us to imagine. We often note that the pyramids in the ancient world were more ancient than we can even imagine. To the ancient world, the pyramids themselves would be ancient. When early Greek historians went around and they needed to find an ancient culture, they would often look to Egypt as being the hallmark of the ancient culture and the ancient world. Egypt is broken down into several kingdoms or dynasties. It has such a long history that indeed it feels that even breaking it up leads to far more information than we can even imagine. But let's break it down into this. We have the Old Kingdom, the First Intermediate Period, the Middle Kingdom dynasties, the Second Intermediate Period, and the New Kingdom dynasties. Now, we really won't be focusing on many of these. We'll only be focusing on a period of one of the intermediate periods, and then one part of the New Kingdom. Which means that all of the Old and Middle Kingdom, including the First Intermediate Period, are really still kind of shrouded in mystery for us. Now, how did Egypt govern itself? Well, the first thing was that it was governed by a king. And the king had unified Upper and Lower Egypt. The king himself was considered divine, was considered to be a child, literally, of the gods. And this is what we call today as the vertical. We see this in some regimes throughout the world. We can think of North Korea or Russia, where the person at top truly is at top, and no one can dare to remove that person. This also creates what we call a command economy. This means that that one person has total control over the resources of that state, but of course that state is limited to only one person's vision. That doesn't always work out so well, especially in areas that are prone to conflict or areas that don't have regular resources. But as we've seen, Egypt had both of these. It was protected mostly from invasion from the outside, and it also had enough provision from the Nile River. But even in the vertical, people need to have underlings. People need to have people to delegate work and resources. And so that's where the bureaucrats come in. Now, Egypt would be divided into what we would call nomes. These could be your districts, your states, whatever you want to call them. And these nomes were governed by various bureaucrats there who would report back to the king of Egypt. Now, you may have heard me say the king of Egypt, and you might say, well, wait, I thought the king of Egypt was called the Pharaoh. No, Pharaoh is actually the word the Egyptians would use for a man who lives in the great house. Now, the greatest house that you can imagine would eventually be the king's house. But they wouldn't refer to him as the king. It would be a long time until he would be referred to as the Pharaoh. But that's similar to how we today talk about rulings or pronouncements or statements or speeches coming out of the White House. It's not the White House, it's the president who's talking about it. And it's not the great house that's issuing these diktats, but rather the Pharaoh, or not the Pharaoh, but the king who lives in the great house. So, that is the king of Egypt. But what did he rule over? Well, he had two kingdoms, and we're going to be very confusing about these two kingdoms. We have the Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt, as makes sense, is down here at the bottom, and Lower Egypt's up here at the top. Actually, Lower Egypt probably goes from about Memphis on up, and Lower Egypt's down here. It starts breaking down a little bit more as we get down to Nubia. All right. But what about here? What about these Upper and Lower Egypts? Well, a gentleman by the name of Namar comes and he unifies Upper and Lower Egypt to create this kingdom. And if you notice, the hat that the pharaohs wore actually brought together the two sides of the red and the white from Upper and Lower Egypt. It was a unified state in that way. Let's talk about religion. Religion in Egypt was important. Religion in Egypt was important. They were polytheists, meaning they believed in many gods. And these multitudes of gods included not just what we would think of, but indeed any kind of local god. This is something we don't understand or can't get our minds around in the modern world. When we think of religion, we think of something written down in the book and scholars examining the texts of those books, trying to figure out exactly what the rules and dictates of the god or deity in those books would say. I can remember being frustrated, though, in my comparative religions class, because religion is such a weird term. Can anyone really describe or define religion? Does it have gods? No gods? Multitudes of gods? The early Christians were told that we were atheists because we weren't polytheists. So, what is a religion? A religion is just what you believe. A religion is what you hope for. Luther talks about how religion can be described as something that we aspire to and what we're drawn to for our security. The polytheists of the ancient world wouldn't have had things written down. That's a gift that we received from the Jewish people, God's people, who scrupulously wrote down the encounters that they had with God, and then demanded that subsequent generations always hold up their beliefs to those things, creating a bedrock. Scripture gives people security. It wasn't the case for the Egyptians. Their beliefs were contained in a multitude of stories. We'll get more to that in just a moment. There were several central gods that they had, but then you also had the local gods. This was common practice in the ancient world. Whenever someone would take over a town, a city, or a district, they would adopt those gods into their pantheon. And so, in addition to the main gods, you had a bunch of local deities. We see this in Greece and Rome as well. This is common practice. And it's not just in towns, but you would have your own household gods. So many gods scurrying about. So many different beings to worship. The central belief of the Egyptians was something called ma'at. This is more than just balance, but rather this regularity, and actually there being a plan within the balance of the universe. The last thing to note is that they believed that their king, the king of Egypt, was the son of Ra, the son of the sun god, and therefore he was in charge of making sure that the world operated within that balance. But how did the world come to be? What did creation look like for the Egyptians? Here things can get a little confusing. The Egyptians had multiple creation myths. There are three major ones. The Heliopolitan one, named after Heliopolis, not their name, by the way, that was what the Greeks called the city. The Memphite creation myth, and the Hermopolitan. Now I'm probably butchering those, there are a lot of syllables in there. The one that comes to us from Heliopolis is where Atum, the creator deity, emerges from the primordial waters of Nu. And there creates the two gods, Shu and Tefnut. These two deities, therefore, afterwards, Shu being air, Tefnut being moisture in the air, give birth to Geb, earth, and Nut, the sky, forming the basis of the cosmos. The Aeneid, these are the 9 deities, the 9 main deities of the Egyptians, also are prominent in the group of the descendants of this, most notably Osiris and Horus. The Memphite creation myth originates in Memphis, and it's centered on Ptah. Now Ptah wakes up on an island in the middle of an expanse of water. And here, Ptah, the creator craftsman god, creates simply by his voice all of existence. Now, what is interesting is then all the other gods are created from Ptah. Finally, the Hermopolitan creation myth is very similar to what we would consider polytheistic mythology, the creation of a group of 8 primordial deities called the Ogdoad, and these deities existing in 4 pairs, each embodying fundamental aspects of the world that people see. Now, Ptah does play a role in bringing about the Ogdoad into existence and creating their union, but this one is far closer to the polytheistic creation myths that we are used to hearing in Greece and Rome. We may wonder what's interesting about this is exactly how a group of people could be so confused about their own creation, and yet in the contemporary world we too find ourselves questioning exactly how the universe started. I actually don't believe that the creation myths matter nearly as much as we might want them to. What is always important is what comes next. And that brings us to the myth of Osiris. Now, the myth of Osiris is really, truly the starting point of this. The creation myth is kind of important for painting a backdrop, almost as you were prepping the canvas. But the Osiris myth gives motivation. It is the artwork. Osiris was a good king, but he was killed by his brother Set, who was jealous of his power. Set was the god of chaos. Osiris's wife, Isis, pieces him back together. And what's interesting about Isis is that she will still remain as a major player even throughout the Greco-Roman period. Even in Britain, as far away as Britain in the Roman times, we find shrines to the goddess Isis. Anyway, Isis goes around the world, and she puts together almost all of Osiris. After he is mostly put together, the two have a son, Horus. And Horus goes out and does the things that a deity will. Now, this picture here is of Osiris, Set, and Horus. The unique thing about Osiris is he is not just the major deity or becomes the major deity in the pantheon, but he's also the god of the underworld. Think about how different that is from what we see in the Greek mythology, where Hades is the god of the underworld, or Pluto if you're Roman. Or think about how Hel is the goddess of the underworld in Norse mythology. But here Osiris is the god. What this means is the fact that death and life are not so different in the Egyptian way of thinking. Osiris becomes the judge of the underworld. And here is kind of how this happens. The soul, or what we would consider the soul of an Egyptian, of a mortal, is placed against a feather. If the soul is lighter than the feather, then the soul, or equal to the weight of the feather, then the soul is considered to be so pure it floats and is allowed to proceed further. It is written down by the scribe god of Egypt. And of course, if he fails, he is eaten by this monstrous deity. The soul then is allowed to continue on to Osiris if it is deemed worthy. And Osiris will reunite it with all the good things, all of the continuity, indeed all of the ma'at that has come before. We're continuing on talking about the conquests of Egypt. Egypt was a major player on the world stage, but also had a very different view of conquest than its neighboring states. Egypt, as we talked about, believed that the Nile provided for them. But the Egyptians were overrun at times when people would be able to get past the Nile. Now, they didn't have an interest in colonies for numerous reasons. Number one, because the Nile was providing everything for them. And number two, that ingrained sense that they had everything they needed made them realize that they really didn't want to conquer or stay in any other place other than Egypt. And so a religious belief started to emerge that you had to be buried back in Egypt. Actually, you had to be buried on the west side of the Nile, because the west side of the Nile was where the sun set, it's where the day ended, and don't you think that your life should work that way too? It wasn't that they wouldn't go out and knock some heads together, but it was that they wanted to stay back in Egypt as much as possible. Now, what they would do, though, is they would go out and they would raid other lands. Sometimes they would raid up here into the land of Canaan, and sometimes they would go down south to the areas underneath Egypt. They sought to just extract resources and tributes from those areas rather than to establish colonies there. And over the course of their history, they didn't really establish any colonies outside of Egypt. They did want to have influence and client states and client kings, and they would come and attack if they felt that they weren't getting the resources they demanded. And they had very formidable armies. At one point, they were taken over by the Hyksos, this group of people from this area here, from the Levant. And the Hyksos came, they overran it, Egypt. They established their pharaohs. It's often assumed this is the time in which we run into the story of Joseph because of the flux of leadership that happens here. It's very interesting. I'm probably getting ahead of myself, but in times of flux, that's also the time of upward mobility. Eventually, Egypt will go back to its more traditional static position. And that means that people from the outside are viewed with suspicion. But they did keep one thing from the Hyksos. They kept the chariots. And they used them to great effect. They were enamored with chariots, which many people refer to as the tanks of the ancient world. They would also create, due to their military might, a counterbalance to the Mesopotamian kingdoms, and they would seek to. The difference being that when you are in this area that's cut off, you can also be cut off from the innovations as well as from the raiding. And while the Mesopotamian empires did have to worry about being overrun or who was coming next to them, it would often create a subconscious arms race. So that eventually, when a power would become dominant in Mesopotamia, it was easy for them to overrun Egypt, which would happen from time to time. So Egypt's buffer could also create complacency. They were a formidable military power, but sometimes they operated with out-of-date technology and out-of-date tactics. All right, now that we have a good idea of who Egypt was, let's talk about the Bible and how the Bible saw Egypt. Egypt is one of the first places to be mentioned in the Bible. We see it in the Torah, most notably in the books of Genesis and Exodus. Now you remember what I told you about the Hyksos invading. The Hyksos come in, they take over, and they need people to run the day-to-day things, the day-to-day work there in Egypt. And they are not so picky. In fact, they probably don't want traditional rulers because one of those traditional Egyptians might claim to be descended from the pharaohs, and in so doing might work to try and elevate himself and kick out the Hyksos. So they were more amenable to bringing in outsiders themselves. They were outsiders. We see this time and time again when you see an outside force take over another nation. They want the legitimacy of that nation, to be sure, but they also want to make sure that they're bringing in outside knowledge. And it's most likely the Hyksos that elevated Joseph to the position that he had. Then what happens is that the traditional rulers of Egypt reassert their power, and you end up in the time of the Exodus. This group is more interested in traditionalism, nostalgia, and indeed trying to resurrect the antebellum status quo. Outsiders are less welcome, and dynamism is replaced by tradition and continuity. Because of this, the Egyptians begin to oppress the Israelite people. Now, during this Exodus saga, we have a bit of a quandary. Did the Exodus actually occur? Now, whether or not the Exodus occurred is a matter of faith. And how it occurred is also a matter of faith. There are two extreme positions. One is that the Exodus didn't really occur at all, and that any kind of writing is just to be unreliable that we run into from the Bible. Another extreme position believes that yes, it did occur, but we can also explain all of the miracles that happen through natural causation. Now, this is one of my favorite fallacies that you run into when you describe the miraculous. It is a circular reasoning that starts off with miracles can't occur. And then when we have instances, documented cases where miracles do occur, people say, well, we know that miracles can't occur, so those really can't be miracles. You see what's happening? They're affirming the consequent. They're affirming that because they don't believe in miracles, any evidence of miracles must be a hoax because we know miracles don't occur. And why don't miracles occur? Because we don't have any evidence. And why don't we have any evidence? Because we know miracles don't occur. And on and on and on in this loop. Now, I believe that God can work and does work through the natural order. But I also know I wasn't there. How God rescued the people of Israel is something that is recorded to us in Scripture. But we can't know what we can't know. And so we have to keep on going and accept as faith that this actually happened. How could this have happened naturally? Well, climatic changes can impact things. The red soil seeping into the Nile can make it appear as blood. This is why the Egyptian magicians were able to actually recreate the water turning to blood. We also know that the Sea of Reeds is shallow enough that it can be parted. And indeed, it was a mistranslation of the Sea of Reeds to the Red Sea that led us to that problem. But it is definitely in the Hebrew Bible, the Sea of Reeds, which is parted. So all of these things can be created naturally, but here's the thing, the fact that one right after the other kind of leads to this exodus is problematic. And of course, the death of the firstborn is also something that can't really be explained from purely naturalistic causes. The other thing we see if we go forward, and Israel has established itself as a kingdom, is in 1st and 2nd Kings. The people of Israel need help to push back their Mesopotamian invaders, and so they do. They call out to Egypt. Now, this is something that is very interesting about Egypt. Egypt is a place of gravitational pull, if you will. It is the push and pull. People are called to it in times of need, and people are pushed out of it as it becomes oppressive. Isn't this what we see in the world? The great scholar H. Richard Niebuhr talks about how Luther's understanding of Christ in relationship to culture is Christ and culture in paradox. The fact that sometimes culture can be used to spread the gospel, but that we shouldn't rely on culture or try to take culture over, because in doing so, we can forget the gospel message. The same is true here in Egypt. Egypt was a place that people would run to and run away from. They would run to when the outside world became oppressive through famine or through invading armies. And they would run away from it when Egypt itself became oppressive, because Egypt is not the promised land. Epilogue. Egypt will finally collapse. In 525, the Persians will overrun it. And then the Persians themselves will be defeated by the Greeks, or a confederation of Greeks underneath Macedonian kingship. The Macedonian Ptolemy will take over as being and call himself the Pharaoh of Egypt. Finally, in 30 BC, the Romans will take it over and turn it into a province, a lucrative one that allows them to provide the bread necessary for the megalopolis